I'm Logan Crawford, and right now on Spotlight, we're speaking with author T.P. Manus Ulzen. He is the man behind Java Hill, an African journey, a nation's evolution through 10 generations of a family linking 4 continents. The author delves into a captivating exploration of history and heritage, tracing the tapestry of a family across generations as well as continents. He uses meticulous research and compelling storytelling and invites readers to embark on a thought-provoking journey as he unravels the interconnectedness of personal narratives and national evolution. We're delighted to have TP join us today on Spotlight. We thank the folks at Great Writers Media for helping us put him in the spotlight today. And we ask viewers like you to support writers like him by subscribing to our channel. Thad, thanks so much for being our guest here today on Spotlight.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Tell us a little bit about the inspiration for you to write Java Hill.
The inspiration, well, okay, there may be 2 pieces of it. Mm-hmm. One of them is the fact that I'm from Ghana, West Africa, and I don't have a typical Ghanaian name. My name is a Dutch name. Mm-hmm. And but the town I come from had a long Dutch history, and so Dutch names are not uncommon, but mine was one of the less common ones. There were a few people called Ulzen or Ulzen around. Mm-hmm. So I guess over the years I kind of wondered how did we come by this name? And then when my father passed away, he was a bit of a historian himself. But we talked about this, but he'd never quite had time in his life to pursue it. So after he died, I was going through his papers and I realized that he was actually also kind of working on this at some point. So I kind of picked it up and decided to run with it, so to speak.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Was doing this genealogy, was it more difficult being from an African-American family where was the record keeping as good as it would for, white families in America, that kind of thing?
Sure. It was a little, because I'm actually from the continent of Africa itself. That's where I was born.
Right.
Most of the records I was looking at were indeed European records, mm-hmm. But I was fortunate because 2 of my ancestors, Dutch ancestors and African ancestors, were actually in the Dutch military. And military always keep very good records.
Right.
Yes. So, and then some of the other records were more related to the transatlantic slave trade, because some of them were also at different times merchants who were involved in the slave trade. And so between the military and the slave trade, I was able to kind of piece together the genealogy over a long period of time. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So you found out that your family was involved in the slave trade and members of your family were also slaves? Give us a little bit more on that.
Yeah, I think it's easier to document the slave trade part itself, because the merchants were easily identifiable. Mm-hmm. Okay, so over the generations, the principal ancestor, shall we call him, called Rolf Ulzen, was a young man whose father died on the Guinea coast in West Africa in the 1700s. And so he was a European who was raised in Africa and grew up, and he later on became actually the chief merchant of the slave trading company. So that was pretty easy because he was identifiable. He was the epochs or the chief merchant, and later on became the governor of the Dutch colony in West Africa, in Elmina, where I was born. So that part was very easy. Now, the other part, which is maybe 10 years ago, I could never have answered that question. But now, because of Ancestry, it's very interesting that, my family's done all the Ancestry DNA and stuff. Mm-hmm. And there are a whole host of people in different parts of the United States that I'm connected to through DNA. So I know that, yes, I have people who are involved in the sordid business of the slave trade, but we were also victims of the slave trade at the same time.
Yeah. When you scratch the surface of anyone's family tree,
right,
you never know what you're going to find out.
You're going to find. Exactly.
And that tree, you know, is much bigger than anyone would suspect. Yes. As you know from doing ancestry.com, is that it starts here, but it quickly goes out here.
Exactly.
And that includes, you know, 16th generational cousins and things like that.
Yes.
Yeah. So putting this in, taking all of these facts that you gathered and putting them into a narrative, that must have been a challenge.
Yes, it was, but it was also exhilarating in a way, because I was, you know, you always have assumptions about things before you go in, and it was interesting to find you know, things that I would not have imagined myself in the story. So it was interesting. I mean, I was discovering, it was really a process of self-discovery in many ways.
Tell me about your personal story about when you emigrated out of Africa into the West.
Right. Well, I'm a physician, so I went to medical school in Ghana. And when I left Ghana, I went to Toronto, Canada. And I did my postgraduate training as a psychiatrist in Toronto, the University of Toronto. So that was in 1980. And I lived and worked in Toronto. My wife and my children, all my children were born in Toronto, and then moved to the United States, I think in 1997. So I've been in academic psychiatry most of my career. So I was at Brody Medical School, where I was teaching for about 11 years. And I've been at the University of Alabama close to about 18 years now. So that's basically my sort of geographical journey in a nutshell.
Yeah. And the title Java Hill, tell the folks at home what it refers to.
So Elmina, which is the town my family comes from, let me answer two questions, even though you've asked one. Elmina is a town I come from, and Elmina was called Elmina by the Portuguese because they arrived there in 1482. And they arrived there in search of gold, and they did find that gold was being traded there. So they called it Elmina, the mine. That's why it's called Elmina. The Portuguese called it Elmina, because they felt that they had found the gold mine that they were looking for. There was really no gold mine there. The gold came from the interior, but it was traded on the coast. Now, Java Hill, the town of Elmina is set between three hills and a river. And Java Hill is one of the hills on the town. And it was called Java Hill because at one point in the 1800s, for most of the 1800s, the Dutch were recruiting African soldiers into their army to fight an insurgency in Indonesia, in Dutch East Indies. And when those soldiers retired, the ones that survived, that did not die, survived, when they came to Elmina, they were given land on this hill to build their houses in their retirement. And this research of mine showed me that my maybe third great grandfather enlisted into this army. And as a young man, he was about maybe 18, got wounded in Sumatra, came back to Elmina in retirement at 24 on a pension, and he lived on Java Hill. So as I went through the process of writing this book, I felt that Java Hill basically sort of captured the essence of the story of migration and return, which is the story of my family over those 10 generations.
And that 10-generation migratory trail spanned 4 continents. I imagine North America, Africa, Europe,
and Asia.
And Asia.
Yeah, the only continent I think we didn't touch was Australia.
Was this story much broader and more engaging than you ever thought it would be when you embarked upon this journey?
Yeah, I think, when I started out, I kind of was looking at people and dates, pretty much, names and dates. Yeah, but it turned out to be a very interesting story because it began really with a young, widower soldier who was being posted to Elmina, and he had his son, and he sought the permission of the city fathers in Briley, Holland, to take his son, 10-year-old son, to Africa with him in the 1700s.
Yeah.
And so this was part of the military records that I found. His name was Jan Ulzen, and he did go onto the posting with his son. He was granted permission, but soon after he got to Africa, he got malaria and died. And the 10-year-old boy was left there with no relatives in the Netherlands. And so he was raised essentially by the company that his father had come to work for. So that's how the story basically started.
And that's an incredible story
Yes.
of survival and perseverance, that this young boy left alone at a young age because his mother died of malaria.
Right.
How did you get those facts about, this dates back to the 1700s. Tell me about the research. Did you actually travel to the area where the young man was raised?
Okay, so part of the impetus also was that there was, at the same time, around the time in 1999 when my father was in his sort of terminal illness, he was approached by a Dutch historian who was researching these Java soldiers, the soldiers that had gone to Java. And so my father had said to her, well, I've given all the family papers to my son in North Carolina because I'm not well, but you can get in touch with him and he'll share with you what he has. And so essentially, she got in touch with me, and she had a name, Bart Ulzen, and said, do you recognize this name? I said, I don't really have any ancestor called Bart, but I'll tell you that there is a name that keeps repeating itself, or variations of a name, and that name is Hermanus. So my great-grandfather, he divided that name between two sons. He called one Herm, and he called one Manus. So it must have meant a lot to him. And Manus is also my middle name. So she took that and went into the Java soldiers' records, the Royal Dutch East Indies Army records, and found Hermanus Ulzen, who was a young man I told you about who went and came back to Java. So basically, once we found that, we started going backwards to see if we could find any other folks. Then we found out that, yes, this young man whose father died and who became governor of the colony was also Ulzen. And then we kept going backwards till we hit the 1700s.
Amazing, amazing. So Bart Ulzen is the patriarch of the family then, in many ways?
So who, Rolof Ulzen?
The young man whose mother died of malaria, was that
was
Bart?
Rolof Ulzen, yes.
Okay.
And he later on became governor of the colony, yes.
Amazing, amazing.
Yeah.
So you have quite a storied history. Again, like I said, this turned out to be a lot more than you probably expected.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Which is quite rewarding as well. And it's also wonderful, I would think, to have roots in so much of the world.
Yes, to be able to relate to different parts of the world in a more sort of personal way.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. What was the most fascinating discovery you made during this this mission to write your family's story of 10 generations?
One of the things that I learned also was that, I think on the face of it, it's difficult to see how people related to each other in different times. But there were all these Dutch merchants and slave traders and other Europeans as well in West Africa during that period of time. But what you realized was that many of them, and Rolof Ulzen is a good example, married an African woman and when he lived in the colony, and he had and had his children. And so many of these folks, for him, as far as I could tell, that was the person he was married to. But many of them had wives in Europe, and they would go to Europe, but then they also had an African family. So they had a European family, and then they had an African family as well. I mean, right. There were no mobile phones or anything then, so I guess it was pretty easy to do that.
Exactly. That's funny.
So that's one of the things I found, that even though the history is written as a antagonist-protagonist story, there was a lot of real life and people living and sharing lives together.
Yeah.
During a very tumultuous time of history at the same time. So that was one of the things that I found very, very fascinating. Yeah.
Absolutely. Absolutely. That is quite a discovery. And I guess it makes sense. I mean, probably in that era, anybody who was that mobile, you know, people being people, men being men,
right.
might have families in both continents. That's for sure. Like you said, they weren't swiping left or right on Tinder back then, but they were traversing the world to their other families, which is, I think, very, very interesting. Is this the first time you've written something other than a scholarly journal or scholarly pursuit?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of a book, yes.
Yeah.
It's the first time I've written something that was not medical. I mean, I did a lot of essays on different issues, political issues and social issues. But it was the first time I've actually put something together in the form of a historical novel. Yes.
And what was it like for you? What was that journey like for you?
It was on and off. I mean, there were times when I kind of left it for a long time and then would come back to it. And my oldest child, my daughter, was very interested in it. And so during one of my off periods, and she was graduating from high school, she said, I want to go to the Netherlands and see what I can find from what you're doing. So as a high school project, she left and went to the Netherlands, met with the Dutch historian that I mentioned, met other historians, and as a high school graduate, just graduating from high school, collected a lot of information. And it was interesting because she arrived in this town, Brilly, which is where the Ulzens come from, and was met by the mayor of the city and was shown the family tree of the Ulzens that they had. And under Roelof Ulzen, they had just written Africans because all his descendants were Africans. And she had come as a real life African, showing them that, yes, here we are. Yeah. And so they added us to the family tree all the way down to the present. So that was amazing.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, you referred to the book a little while ago as a novel. It's a true story, but I guess in part it's novelized because there's a little supposition in there and that kind of thing.
Yeah, I mean, I see it as a historical novel because it is a collection of historical events, but they're also of people about whom we know certain things, but not everything. So a lot is left to your imagination as different people are described and as they come up. For one thing that I, for example, this reminds me of, is that at one point in this story, the Roelof Ulzen retires and he has to return to the Netherlands. But he hadn't been to the Netherlands since he was 10 years old, and he didn't know anybody there. And so when he was leaving Elmina to go to the Netherlands, he left with his 10-year-old son, just like his father had left with him, his 10-year-old African son. Then they went to Suriname. Now, this is interesting. So he has his African son on the ship, but he goes to Suriname and he discharges 364 slaves, Africans as well. And then on his way to Rotterdam from Suriname, he also has, it looks like a heart attack, and he dies in the mid-Atlantic. And guess what? His son is 10 years old now, an African arriving in Europe. with his father's worldly possessions. Amazing. I mean,
Yeah.
can't make up stuff like that.
Absolutely. Yeah, it is an amazing story. Have you thought about this perhaps as a book or a TV series at all?
Yeah, it's
I mean, a
you
movie
know,
or a
it
TV
has
series.
occurred because it is a multi-generational story. A number of individuals a number of people have suggested that yeah, this could make a really good miniseries or television saga, yes, or even a big screen movie, yes.
It's kind of an epic tale. And
Yes,
like I said, there's a lot of twists and turns in there that no one would expect or predict.
exactly.
So, yeah. How helpful was Ancestry DNA in putting together this story?
Oh, this story was before Ancestry DNA sort of made its real debut in our lives.
Mm,
But in retrospect, it has been useful. For example, in answering your first question about what connections would I have here in North America genetically, and
right,
without Ancestry DNA, I wouldn't have known that. But
right.
we're able to do that now. And my daughter, for example, is actually looking at developing through DNA these kinds of connections between Africans and African Americans is something that she's trying to do as a project of hers.
That sounds great. That sounds like a very, very intriguing project because I feel as though, and I'm not African American, so I don't know, but I only know what I feel and what I think. I feel like a lot of African Americans really don't know their roots, so to speak,
Right.
that they're lost in Africa.
Mm-hmm.
Do you feel the same way? I mean, you know your story so fully now, you know?
Yes, yes. I mean, I think that is one of the greatest sort of human costs of the slave trade is that people who were brought here were sort of wrenched away from their heritage
Right.
and their history. And now, at least, we have the science that allows us the possibility of going back to with some accuracy to places that they're connected to and people that they might actually be connected to. So it raises a completely different prospect for people of African descent in North America and Canada, the US, the Caribbean, this part of the Western Hemisphere. It really does.
Yeah, that's truly intriguing
Yeah,
because, you know, the history since slavery is really just a snap in the time of history.
exactly.
I mean, we get back to 1850 and earlier and so forth,
Mm-hmm.
very, very quickly and just in a few generations. But to be able to use science to get beyond that, I think is wonderful.
Yeah.
I'm intrigued by your work as a psychiatrist and whether it informed your work as an author. When you are writing and you are novelizing, did you try to get into these people's heads a little bit, figure out their motives, their actions, their habits, that kind of thing?
Yeah, yeah. I mean that's unavoidable.
Yeah. Occupational hazard, right?
Yes, it was kind of unavoidable, but I think one of the things that struck me the most was probably just the irony of a number of things, like the guy who's on the ship with his African son, but then at the same time has Africans in the cargo hold of the ship and is going to sell them. I mean, you kind of wonder. I mean, how does that happen? I mean, how does he do that?
Right.
How does he manage to do that? You know?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
So there were things like that, and when the young lad arrives in Rotterdam, 10 years old, with his father's stuff, the person who actually is most helpful to him is his father's slave trading partner, a man called Herman Koopstad.
Yeah.
The rest of the people are just coming in and they want to take the stuff off the ship.
Right.
And it's this slave trader who says to them, you got to leave something for this little boy.
Right.
You know?
Right. Which I guess is, as you know through your profession, that people who do evil things aren't necessarily 100% evil.
Yeah, yeah.
There are moments of humanity,
human beings
right?
are very complex.
Yeah.
Right? And you see the complexity of human beings, good and bad,
Right.
throughout the story. I mean, it offers you that kind of opportunity, and there are many moments of irony in it. Yes.
Yeah. Yeah, that is an amazing juxtaposition. Like you said, that he's protective of this one young man, but has others in shackles. But
Exactly.
people compartmentalize their lives all the time, I guess. And for him, it was just business, as crazy as it sounds to us today. Tell me, now you know the etymology of your name greater than most of us know. Is it rewarding? Do you feel very accomplished having written this book? Do you feel like you've left a legacy for your family to build upon?
Yeah, well, yes. I think, somebody asked me one time, what is the greatest thing about writing this book? And I told them I felt that it was probably the most valuable gift I could give my children, because it basically tells them who they are, or as we joke sometimes in the family, who we were.
Yeah.
So
exactly.
So you kind of have an idea who you were 10 generations ago and who you are now.
But it is fascinating. And I've done a little of it myself through Ancestry. I found out my great-great-great-grandfather was a hero in the Civil War and ran a general store by the Finger Lakes, upstate New York. I mean, there's certain things that are really fascinating about our lives, and it's interesting to become a detective and find out what your life story is all about, because we watch other people's stories all the time.
That's right.
Sometimes ours is just as fascinating, if not more.
That's right. Yes.
Absolutely. This book is wonderful. It is called Java Hill, An African Journey, A Nation's Evolution Through 10 Generations of a Family Linking 4 Continents. It is meticulously researched by T.P. Manus Ulzen, who has written a book that will keep you captivated. It surprised him at times, it'll surprise you at times, and it'll keep you turning the pages, and might even get your curiosity burning a little bit to find out, well, what happened to my family as well.
Exactly.
Thad, thank you so much for joining us here today on Spotlight.
It's been my pleasure.
Pleasure's all mine, sir. And to the folks at home, I'm Logan Crawford, thanking you for your time, this time until next time on Spotlight.